We are currently in the greenhouse of Art Lab Gnesta, just outside the old brewery building where our residency is located. And I just want to mention that behind us is the railroad tracks, so you might hear the train passing by occasionally. And I also want to say that we will record today's talk. But first, some context. The last couple of years, Art Lab Gnesta and Västerås konstmuseum have together invited Nordic and Baltic artists to a residency stay and to produce new works of art in an interdisciplinary collaboration that grows out from the landscapes of Sörmland and Västmanland. And apart from Goda, we currently also have Norwegian artist Anna Ile working within the project here at Art Lab currently. And the invited artist in this project, which we named Plein-Air Residency, they begin to work new works of art based on questions on the surrounding landscapes in very different and open ways. And during a time when many artists have difficulty on gaining resources for supporting the production of new works, we want to, through this collaboration, provide both space and opportunity for new works of art to emerge, and to do this in conversations with local voices and both scientific and historical references. And the residency stays are tailored for the invited artists with a focus on meetings with different expertise on site.
Yeah, and we're really happy to be doing this together. Now the train is passing. It's passing quite quickly. And our collaboration between our two quite different organizations is really enabling working with artists in new ways and making it possible for the new production of new artworks and also for the display of artworks, which is really amazing, I think. So moving onward to today's guest and our current residency, artist in residence, Goda Palekaite. Goda is a contemporary artist from Vilnius, now living in Brussels. In her works, Goda is focusing on ideas and individuals who throughout history has challenged our conceptions of the world and society. At a residency in Gothenburg at Konstakademin in 2019, she worked around the famous theologist and mysticist Emmanuel Swedenborg. And we're very happy to have Goda back in Sweden for further research around the connection between Swedenborg and the artist Ivan Aguéli. And Goda's ongoing research, which she will share with us now briefly, will lead up to an exhibition which will be presented in Västerås at Västerås konstmuseum in 2023. So with this, I would like to thank Nordic Culture Point, which is enabling this residency, but also JASPIS, the Swedish Arts Grants Committee, as well as Lithuanian Council of Culture, for making this talk possible. And some practicalities. You are able to have questions during the talk. So, and please write them in the chat function, and we will try to conclude it at the end of the talk. And please also turn off your microphones during the talk, and it will be a little bit easier for everyone to hear Goda as she's speaking. So without further ado, I will hand over to Goda. Very welcome.
Hello. Hello, everybody. Thank you for such a nice introduction, and thank you for inviting me here, and I'm very glad to be here. I will then not further introduce myself and my work, but start right away talking about the characters I'm following here. Ivan Aguéli, who is a local character whom many of you listening to me today already know. And let me also share some images with you. Mm-hmm. Okay. Okay, so Ivan Aguéli was born in Sala, northwest from Stockholm, in 1869 in the family of a veterinary doctor, and was actually given the name of Jon Gustav Aguéli. As you see, the spelling is different. But later in his life, he decided to change the spelling of his name before moving to Paris to a more French version. And also he used the Ivan, Russian version of Jon, instead to, I guess, sound a bit more international. And then once again, later, when he converted to Islam, he decided to change his name once again to Abdalhadi Aguéli, meaning the servant of the guide. So already this biographical fact of changing the name several times in one life tells us something about Ivan's chameleonic nature and his drastic search for identity. Now, as for his profession, Aguéli is now mostly known as a painter, which was not the case when he was alive, because he was pretty unknown as a painter. But we can also see him as an anarchist, a scholar of religion, a linguist, an art theorist, a writer, a journalist, a traveler, an orientalist, a Sufi practitioner, and even more. So I'm indeed interested in Aguéli's legacy, which is much larger than his small-scale post-impressionistic paintings. And I'm following Aguéli as a character, as a semi-fictional character with countless unknowns. And I'm interested in him on the one hand as a radical nonconformist, and on the other hand as a typical child of his times. So in a way, as I believe as every artist is. And I'm searching for a universal cliché of an artist, one can say, or artist's prototype, or the gene of the genius. And of course, while studying the universal cliché of an artist, in Ivan's case, I'm also trying to understand myself. So myself as an artist, as a writer, traveler, anthropologist, anarchist, enthusiast of mysticisms and esotericisms, and I see many actually meeting points between Aguéli and myself. And I remember when I was young, when I was an art student, I couldn't stop questioning whether I was talented or not. It was such a burden, such a actually nightmare, because talent was still a thing back then. And the scariest thing was that you could not know, nobody could tell you whether you are talented, but you desperately needed to know as an artist, because in case you don't possess this mystical gene of the genius, you better stop doing art altogether and do something else with your life. So my solution was to just quit doing art and leave my country and learn a new language and go study anthropology and write a master thesis on conditions of creativity. And well, Ivan did something like that as well. So in his 30s, he would quit painting for 10 years to focus on writing and traveling and new languages and the spiritual studies of Sufism. And in 1912, when he finally started painting again, he had the first and the only chance in his life to exhibit his works. It was at the Swedish Artists Association group exhibition in Stockholm, but he didn't even stay for the opening. So he decided to move back to Paris on the day of the opening, which might seem like he didn't care about painting, but trust me, he did care. All these years that he was not painting, he was writing about it, both in private correspondences and in international journals and publications. For example, in a letter to a friend, Ivan calls painting the most jealous mistress he has ever had. And he had many mistresses. So another friend writes from Paris about Ivan's partying style, like that. Aguéli is here like a fish in water. He is a strange figure, much sought after by women. He lives nowhere and everywhere, absolutely does not want to give an address, shows up and disappears, wearing a black tight velvet coat and trousers as large as bags. But Parisian women love the Apache style above all others. So you see the description Apache style, as well as trousers as large as bags, are typical for the times of Orientalism, which now can be defined as the Western upper classes and the intellectuals' fascination with the exoticized East or the other in more general terms. It, of course, resulted out of centuries of Europocentric thinking and colonial power relations, but it reached its peak exactly at the lifetime of Aguéli. At the end of the 19th century and the beginning of the 20th century, the Orientalist desire was in the air, and it was the so-called Zeitgeist, or the spirit of the times. Think of the paintings of Henri Matisse and Paul Gauguin. Think of all the world expos with exotic creatures and exotic people in cages and all that. Ivan started studying Egyptian art and Eastern philosophy already in Stockholm, spending endless days in the Royal Library, where he also read Quran for the first time. Once in Paris, he enrolled at the École Spéciale des Langues Orientales Vivantes to study Oriental languages. Then in 1894, he was arrested for participation in anarchist uprisings, which was also so typical for the bohemian circles of his times, and ended up in prison for 4 months, where he doesn't waste time, but read history of philosophy and religion and Islamic poetry. So when he finally was free, he left Europe and traveled to Egypt to settle in Cairo. And here are some images from Cairo taken pretty much at the same time, just a little earlier than Ivan lived there. And they are made by another child of his times, Pascal Seba. So Pascal Seba was a Syrian-Armenian photographer who lived in Constantinople and in, today it's Istanbul, and in Cairo, and who produced a huge amount of these beautiful, nostalgic, romantic images of Egypt, Turkey, and other places. These images that we until now see as kind of the old Orient. They still work, even though many of them are staged and people are posing here with costumes, for example. But the interesting thing is that Pascal Seba didn't see himself so much as an artist, but rather as a businessman. He worked in a relatively new and quickly progressing business of travel and tourism. So he produced and staged these pictures mostly for postcards that the increasing numbers of Western tourists would desire to bring back home from the exotic Orient. And even his studio was called El Sharq, meaning the Orient. Another interesting character who lived at a similar time, just a little later than Ivan Aguéli, was Esad Bey. Here you see a picture from my performance, which is called How to Infuriate a Historian in Brussels, where Esed Bey was performed by the artist Sina Seife, who is in the middle here. So Esed Bey was a pseudonym of a Jewish writer and journalist who was born on the train traveling from west to east and raised in Baku, Azerbaijan, another famous destination of the Orient. But being a son of a rich man, he had to flee Bolsheviks, and he lived most of his life in anti-Semitic Germany, where he obtained a certificate claiming that he had converted to Islam. But people who knew him actually claimed that he never even read Quran. However, Esed Bey became a best-selling writer in the very competitive European interwar literary scene by writing on topics that in the Western world were hardly known, such as the Caspian Sea, the Caucasus, black oil, Islam, and the Orient. He also, by the way, liked dressing up in Oriental style, just like Ivan did in Paris, Esed Bey did as well in the parties in Berlin and Vienna. So Esed became international celebrity and his books were praised by Nazis until his Jewish origin was uncovered and the books were actually forbidden and burned, and Esed was prosecuted. Today, Esed Bey is often criticized for exoticizing and misrepresenting his home region and its peoples as primitive and barbarous and greedy and cruel. So, as we see, Ivan Aguéli was not at all exceptional for his times. Perhaps he was more sincere or more naive than the other two. At least it doesn't seem like he actively or consciously or successfully sold the image of the Orient. Instead, he was on a constant search and research trip and artistic research, I would say. When I look at him from my perspective today, there is another important aspect that relates me and him, which is the desire for transition, transgression, or liminality. Arnold van Gennep introduced the concept of liminality around the same time when Ivan was practicing it. Van Gennep was a folklorist, which is close to what we call today anthropologists. And as anthropologists do, he was analyzing the rites of passage or the transformative elements of social life, such as weddings and funerals and initiation rituals and others. And as liminality, he described precisely that state, the psychic and the emotional state of being in between. So in between knowing one thing and knowing another, or being one thing and being another. It's the state of ambiguity and disorientation. And I believe often it's the state of creativity. So my research on liminality is not classical in anthropological sense. I don't study social rituals as Van Gennep proposed, but rather I'm interested in it in personal sense. So I'm interested in personal journeys and often secret transitions and transformations, sometimes never ending and often accompanied by dreams and visions, and often placing the person outside of the society and alienating him or her. And I'm interested in what can one do with such life? So what do you do in this liminal and unsure and precarious and maddening phase? How do you transform the fragility into a creative process? How do you expand the horizons instead of squeezing them into the limiting expectations of your current society? This is an image from my exhibition Liminal Minds at Konstepidem Gallery in Gothenburg, where I stayed for 3 months in residency in 2019. The exhibition was dedicated to two men, French anthropologist and surrealist writer Michel Leiris, and to my best teacher of liminality, the one who introduced me to Ivan Aguéli, Emmanuel Swedenborg. Emmanuel Swedenborg lived in the juncture of 17th and 18th centuries, and during his lifetime he was very well known in numerous scientific fields. And here are just some of them. He was an anatomist, astronomer, botanist, chemist, cosmologist, economist, editor, engineer, geologist, mathematician, metallurgist, mineralogist, philosopher, physicist, and the list continues. And so he was indeed a scholar of incredible energy and productivity in basically all the scientific fields of the time. And at the age of 56, he was trying to determine the exact position of the soul in the human body, so anatomically. Just like Ivan Aguéli later was trying to determine the anatomic place of universal intelligence, and just like scientists until today believe that they can find the gene of the genius. So in fact, Swedenborg was very close to an answer when he saw his first vision of Christ. And so ecstatic dreams and revealing visions did not abandon him since then, but they made him abandon his scientific career and go towards the so-called mysticism. So he started regularly visiting heaven and hell, which he could describe with engineer's precision, and having conversations with angels and other spiritual creatures. And of course, he was then drastically excluded from the scientific discourse, which we have to keep in mind was just separating at that time from the church. And so even though later some would argue that Swedenborg was schizophrenic, and he definitely went through some transformative inner journeys. But for me, what is the most interesting is what he managed to do here was a radically experimental critique of both Western science and Christianity. So he managed to build a world based on his scientific knowledge in combination with his dream life and visions. And this methodology keeps fascinating me hundreds of years later. Now, what fascinated Ivan Aguéli about Swedenborg was not necessarily the same, but rather his writings, theological writings. So in his young age, Ivan was a believer, or Swedenborgian, who carefully studied his teachings and who was even planning to publish a book on Swedenborg. He also is thought to have interpreted Swedenborg's teachings of the spiritual reality in his paintings. And so even later in his life, after converting to Islam, he writes to Madame Marie Ur, "You may know that I have three people to thank for my inner life and my faith. Swedenborg, who has given me mysterious upbringing through which I have defended myself against all Protestantism and Germanization. You, who have given me a heart, and Mohyiddin ibn Arabi, who has freed me from violence." So who was this Marie Ur who gave Ivan a heart? She was a French poet and anarchist and animal rights activist, theosophist, and she was married to the founder of a magazine, l'Encyclopédie Contemporaine Illustrée, which published and funded some of Ivan's writings. Marie was 20 years later than Ivan, and their relationship, although never official, became very intense and lasted for almost 20 years. I can mention just a detail of their love story when Marie demands proof of Ivan's love. And so in protest against the cruelty with animals, the two go to corrida, and Ivan tries to shoot Matador with a shotgun. He fails. Matador is just slightly injured, and Aguéli is of course imprisoned again, but he's soon released. The most fortunate is that the debate following this attack contributed to banning bullfight in France forever. So it seems like life of an artist has to be marked by dramatic love relationships, deep doubts, and drastic life changes for mysterious reasons. And even Ivan's death on October 1st, 1917 is somewhat dramatic and mysterious, and yet an absurd ending for such an intense life he had. He was hit by a train outside of Barcelona during the First World War that he didn't fight in. And it is up to this day unclear how and why he was hit. Some say he was becoming deaf and didn't hear the train, and some guess he jumped in front of the train, which sounds quite convincing when you read his last letters to his mother and his friends, which are quite depressing. Now, you might wonder what I, as an artist working today, do with these historical characters, with Ivan Aguéli and Emmanuel Swedenborg and Esad Bey and others. And so first of all, I read about them and I read them. And at the moment, I am mostly reading Ivan's letters. And most of his letters are in Swedish and in French. And my French is not very good yet. I'm studying it. And my Swedish, as you can imagine, is not good at all. So I'm working with a translator who is much more than a translator to me. He is also an interpreter and my consultant, because he knows Ivan much better than I do. He is an artist himself, and just a second, I want to show him to you. Voila, here he is, Pascal Crepeau Vibe. So it's amazing. He is my translator, but he also is Ivan Aguéli here in this beautiful short film directed by his father, Gert Vibe and Peter Ostlund. So it sounds strange. I know that everybody is somehow connected, but it is usually like that. Whenever I start working, there appear endless connections. Like in a detective's cabinet, at first you just have lots of unknowns, and then you start discovering that things are connected, and you start seeing these relations that other people might not from the first gaze. And usually there are these transchronological connections that ignore physical space and time. And so after this detective work, I go on a research trip searching for the character. And usually it is a very intimate journey where I encounter landscapes and spaces and places that these people whom I see as my intellectual ancestors and as my predecessors lived in. It is usually both real, physical, but also a fictional and ethnographic and speculative at the same time journey. Just a second, I want to come back. And how do I go back to the PowerPoint? Mm. And it's charging, right? Because it was saying that it will stop, it will lose battery. Okay, so we're back to some technical questions. So, about my journeys. So here is the place that I visited and stayed at 10 days ago. The place that makes Sala, where Ivan Aguéli was born and grew up in, a famous town. So it's the old silver mine of Sala. One image shows the entrance to the mine, another one the industrial kind of structure that hosts the deepest shaft of the mine. So they started digging silver in the area at least in the 16th century, which means it was there and active not only when Aguéli lived there, but even when Swedenborg, who was the chief mining engineer of Sweden, and who for sure knew all the mines in the country, lived. So we all meet in the mine in a way. I slept in the hotel, which is located in one of the buildings of the historical site. And there were men working there every day, every morning from 6:30. And it looked like a building site full of noise and dust. And so I asked the receptionist what it is all about, because the Sala silver mine is actually not active anymore. So she explained to me that because of extracting metals and minerals for centuries, the soil in the territory is so polluted and all the areas so full of poisonous chemicals that they have to replace the old soil with a new one. So that is what the workers are doing. And at that moment I thought, well, if I was Ivan, I would also dream of leaving this mining town, this industrial and exploitative and polluting place as soon as I grow up. And then, as if not enough, I also went deep into the mine, so hundreds of meters deep into the stone, and it felt like going into the landscape vertically and into the history of the earth, which seemed scary and wet and dark and unknown and incredible at the same time. And so I go on these trips and I see what I find there. And just now I'm here in the middle of it in Gnesta. And then later I make exhibitions and performances and I write. And so this is my book called Schismatics, which was published last year. It's a bilingual book in Lithuanian and English. And it contains fictional biographies of 11 historical characters that appeared in my exhibitions and performances before. And so in these texts, I do take the official historical accounts that I find through my desk research, and I merge them together with the accounts that are considered not reliable, such as gossips or dreams or opinions and so on. And then I add my own dimension of speculation and inventions and my own personal history. And so both Swedenborg and Esad Bey are important characters in this book, as well as one more Swedish woman character, Andrietta Nobel, who was the mother of the brothers Nobels. And Ivan Aguéli, well, I hadn't met him yet at that time when I was writing it. So he's not there, but I will continue living with him by my side, and he will definitely show up in my next exhibition at Västerås Konstmuseum. And that is all. Thank you for listening.
Hi. Thank you so much, Goda.
Thank you very much.
To listen to you. And I wonder if should we start by seeing if there anyone who has a question. And if you feel uncomfortable in writing in English, you can of course write in Swedish as well, and we can translate.
Yes. So please share your questions in the chat, but maybe you and I should start, Katrin.
Yeah.
Would you like to go first?
Yeah, we're actually, it looks a bit weird. We're in two different screens, but Goda is right here next to us, so why I direct myself to you. So thrilling to hear you like just diving into this person of Ivan Aguéli. And I mean, in Sweden, Ivan is of course known as this painter and foremost, and we've seen a number of really big shows in large institutions with his work, and I know the majority of his work are today owned by the National Museum and Moderna Museet in Sweden. So many of you might know him just as a painter, and I think most of people recognize him as this painter. How have you? You're looking at some other aspects, it seems like, in his life. Can you tell us a little bit how you're like looking at him as a painter and as a person, and how are there any relations between those two? And
yeah, for me, yeah. For me, Ivan Aguéli is interesting as a kind of interdisciplinary artist or thinker. So we have this category today. Of course, in his time, he the painter was kind of the artist. Let's say prototype, or the exemplary artist would be a painter, because it was the most pure form of art, which had to do also, which was of course the separation between the visual arts and the performing arts, or design, or architecture, or theater. This all was, the gaps were much wider. And today, an artist like me, who has a bit of the background in all of this, can be interested, and I think it is very interesting about Ivan Aguéli that he was, in a way, working in all these transdisciplinary connections, like I'm doing today, without knowing that this what he's doing with his writing, with his decisions of life, with his maybe how he, as we saw, how he dresses up for a party, and how he creates his persona. This all can also be seen as part of his artistic life. So for me, that is very interesting. And I think his painting is already very much acknowledged, and there is no need for me to work on that aspect of him, but the other aspects of his life and career and him as a character is not very much discussed, neither in Sweden nor internationally. So I think
very well known outside Sweden, seems like, or at least not in the English text has been. I mean, he's writing in all these. What languages is he using in his letters? He is using many languages.
So generally in his life, he's a real polyglot, and maybe that was even his biggest talent, if you want to search for talents. But I think only in the Swedish-speaking world.
Oh, that's a small world.
But
it's also
well,
part of, as you said, the Paris community.
Yeah, but he didn't become popular as an artist in his time, so he has never exhibited anywhere except of one exhibition in Stockholm when he was alive. And well, I'm not a historian, so maybe somebody would know better. But as far as I know, he's not. Then later has not been discovered, let's say, in the French art scene.
I was wondering if you could elaborate something of how your research will continue, if you know anything about that, because now you have been here for a couple of weeks and you have been to Sala, to the Aguéli Museum and to the silver mine, and like the result will be an exhibition, of course, but that will be in a couple of years. Do you know how you will, what's the next step for you in this process?
I think I still have a lot of homework to do, so I still have to read a lot and to study his work, Ivan's work in different areas a lot, which also leads then, like if I'm studying him as Sufi, I have to learn something about Sufism. If I'm studying him as an anarchist, I have to learn something about anarchism, which fortunately I already know a bit of. So it's, the context is so important in studying a character like that, it's not just reading the letters or the biography. But so studying is one thing, but then in my work, it's very important for me to find my personal connection to the character. So I have to still articulate it in a way, because as I told you today, I see intuitively lots of connecting points between how I see the world or how I am in the world and how he might have seen the world. But I have to still find out what we can do together, Ivan and me.
Yes, thank you. Yeah. We got, it's not a question, but a comment here about this new biography on Ivan Aguéli by Mark Sedgwick and others, but that we already have. Thank you so much for the comment and the reference.
Yeah, and it's one of the first larger writings in English about Aguéli, so that's really amazing. And I think there is a talk by Mark Sedgwick on Aguéli, which Aguéli Museum did last year, I think. So, and that can still be viewed if one go to the Aguéli Museum website as well. I encourage everyone to do. And I would also like to say that as working at Västerås konstmuseum, I mean, Aguéli is one of the most important artists in our collection, which is one of the first artists actually that was collected to the collection around 1920, when the collection was quite new at the time then. And they remain some of the most important artworks in the collection. And hopefully we can also introduce these somehow in your exhibition. I hope, at least, as a kind of reference, a point of reference to the more contemporary work made by you, Goda.
I think so.
Indecisions right now.
Yes, perfect.
They are it.
Usually, the process, my process starts with the research, and then the research leads actually to the artwork, so I don't know in advance, you know, what the exhibition will be, how it will look, what even medium it will be, because it always depends on the research process where it's going to bring me. But of course, in this case, it's a little bit different because I'm working with another artist, Ivan Aguéli, who already has created his pieces, and I in no way want to kind of dismiss his painter's contribution. So I think we will see. That sounds like pitching the exhibition, but I think we will see his artworks as well in the exhibition. Yeah.
I know that you see Ivan Aguéli as much more than just landscape painter, but Goda was just wondering also, since this collaboration residency project that you're part of is interested in the landscape surrounding Art Lab Gnesta and Västerås konstmuseum. Could you say something about maybe your personal or artistic relationship to the landscape as such? I know that you're also working with another project concerning geology, right? Is that something you would like to tell us more about, perhaps?
So until now, I haven't used the term landscape in my conceptual thinking and in my research, but I used a lot of I thought a lot about geography. So geography and space and place and the differences between those, and which might be a bit more cultured terms than landscape. But I don't think they are so far away from each other. I don't think that you cannot make them somehow work for each other. So so far in this research, I am surrounded by this beautiful Swedish landscape of Gnesta and its surroundings, which remind me very much of home, because the landscape in Lithuania is very similar, and which really inspires and feeds my long already need for this kind of more larger scale of nature than you get when you live in the city of Brussels, which I also love, of course. But when you live in the confinement times in an apartment and you only go to the park and you're not even allowed to go anywhere further, you start really missing the landscape. So I'm really enjoying that, and of course it also stays all the time in the back of my head that my character also is from here, no? So it formed him. It did something to him and to his work. And then this other very interesting experience for me was to go down in the Sala mine, which is not what we understand as landscape in the traditional sense, but for me it was a kind of a journey, a vertical journey in the landscape. So it was going inside the landscape, deep in there. And that relates also to my interest in geology, because geology is working with a kind of history of the landscape or history of the earth, no? And in the next project that I'm, after this research trip, I'm going to the UK to just to answer your question about the other project. So together with Adriana Gvozdenovic, an artist and collaborator, we are going to a residency at Delfina Foundation in collaboration with Arts Catalyst Institute in London and Sheffield, and we are going to research the landscape or the geography and geology and history of the region of Dorset, which is the south coast of England, where another historical character, a woman called Mary Anning, lived, and she was the first person supposedly to discover the dinosaur fossils. So she was kind of the first paleontologist. Still quite unknown and not fully recognized, and so on. So we are going to look in that Earth as a historical character and historical characters who dealt with the Earth. And that has a lot to do with the landscape, so I will also know more about it when I come back.
So great. If there are no further questions, I think we will thank you so much, Goda, for letting us inside your research right now. And also a great thank you to all of you at home for joining us this evening. And yeah, hope to see you soon again.
Yes, and I mean, at least in 2 years.
At least in 2 years,
konstmuseum.
Great.
Right? Yes.
Okay.
Yes. Thank you very much from Gnesta tonight, and thank you, Goda.
Thank you for inviting me and for listening. And yeah, see you sooner than in 2 years.
Yes.
We'll talk about it on the go.
Exactly. Yes. Great. So bye-bye.
Bye.